It was 3:47 in the morning, and I was sitting alone in a hospital bathroom with the shower running. Not because I needed a shower, but because I didn't want anyone to hear me crying. My daughter had been born 6 weeks early. 3 pounds, 11 ounces. Her lungs weren't ready, her body wasn't ready, and honestly, I wasn't ready either. But nobody asked me about that part. I had been in the middle of making dinner when it happened. 1 minute I was stirring pasta, the next I was on the floor with a pain so sharp I couldn't breathe. My husband wasn't home yet. I called 911 myself, I rode in the ambulance by myself, and by the time my husband made it to the hospital, they had already taken our daughter away to the NICU, and I was lying in a recovery bed with an IV in my arm, and a nurse who kept asking me to rate my pain on a scale of 1 to 10. I couldn't answer her. I kept asking where my baby was. At some point that night, I think it was around midnight, I picked up my phone and I sent a message to the family group chat. Both sides, my family, my husband's family, all of them in one place. The message was simple. I wrote, "Hadley came early. We're in the NICU at St. Catherine's. She's fighting hard. Please pray for her." Then I put my phone down and went back to staring at the ceiling. By morning, there were 42 responses in the chat. My mother sent a string of crying emojis and then, 20 minutes later, asked if I had remembered to call my health insurance about the out-of-network billing. My father, who is not a man of many words, replied with a single thumbs up. My husband's older brother, Marcus, sent a voice memo that was mostly background noise from what sounded like a sports bar. His wife, my sister-in-law Diane, sent a paragraph about how premature births often happen because of stress during pregnancy, and that maybe I should think about whether my job had been too demanding on my body. She typed that. She actually typed that. And then she added a praying hands emoji at the end, as if that made it better. My husband's mother, I'll call her Sandra, sent nothing that night. Not a single word. We found out the next morning she had seen the message because her read receipt was there, that little timestamp sitting underneath my words like a judgment. She had read it and gone to sleep. The only person who called was my younger sister, Becca. She called at 1 in the morning, and when I answered, she didn't say anything for a second, and then she said, "Tell me where you are. I'm coming." And I told her I was fine, that there was nothing she could do, that it was the middle of the night. She said, "I know. Tell me where you are anyway." She drove 4 hours that night. She arrived at 6 in the morning with gas station coffee and a blanket she had grabbed off her own couch, and when she walked into that waiting room and saw my face, she didn't say a word. She just sat down next to me and put her arm around me. And that was the first time I cried. Really cried. The ugly kind. Becca stayed for 3 days. She slept in the chair next to me. She learned the nurses' names. She held my hand every single time we walked into the NICU to stand over Hadley's isolette and watch her tiny chest rise and fall with the help of machines. Nobody else came. Days passed. I sent updates to the group chat because that's what you do. You keep people informed, you try to stay connected, you tell yourself they care even when the evidence is pointing somewhere else entirely. I sent pictures of Hadley when we were allowed. I updated them on her weight, on her oxygen levels, on the small victories that feel enormous when your child is fighting for her life. My mother replied to the photos with heart emojis. My father replied to nothing. Sandra, my mother-in-law, began sending my husband private messages asking when she could visit. Not us, not the hospital, but us, meaning our home, when we returned. As if she were already planning her visit to the healthy baby and skipping the hard part entirely. Diane sent me an article about the benefits of skin-to-skin contact for premature infants. I had been doing skin-to-skin every single day. The nurses had shown me how on day 2, but Diane, who had never set foot in an NICU, who had never sat in a hospital parking garage and sobbed before going back inside because she needed to look calm for her baby, Diane sent me a link with a note that said, "Thought this might be helpful." My husband Daniel was incredible through all of it. He is the kind of person who holds everything together even when he is falling apart, and I knew he was falling apart because I could see it in the way he got very quiet in the evenings, the way he stared at his food instead of eating it. He had gone back to work after the first week because we needed the insurance, we needed the income, we needed the life that existed outside that hospital to keep functioning, so we had something to come home to. He drove to the hospital every morning before work, stayed as long as he could, drove back in the evenings, and somewhere in between, he was trying to manage our house, our bills, our dog, and his own terror. I watched him do all of that, I watched him hold himself together for me, for Hadley, for everyone, and I watched his family do nothing. There was a woman in the NICU. Her name was Renee, and her son had been born at 28 weeks. She had been there longer than I had. She knew which nurses worked which shifts. She knew where the good vending machine was. She knew that if you asked the charge nurse nicely, they'd sometimes let you bring in a real blanket from home instead of the hospital-issued ones. Renee became one of the most important people in my life during those weeks, and we had met because she sat down next to me in the family lounge and said, "First time?" And I nodded, and she said, "It gets easier to breathe. Not better, just easier to breathe. There's a difference." There was also Patricia, whose daughter was in the isolette next to Hadley's. Patricia was 53 years old and was raising her granddaughter because her own daughter was not able to. She brought homemade food in Tupperware containers and shared it with whoever was in the lounge, and she called all of us baby in a way that felt like being wrapped in something warm. And there was a night nurse named Cora who had been working in the NICU for 19 years and who, on my worst night, found me standing in the hallway outside Hadley's room, unable to make myself go in. And she stood with me for 10 minutes without saying a word, and then she said, "She knows your voice. You can talk to her from the door if that's all you've got tonight. That still counts." These women, Renee, Patricia, Cora, they became my family in that hospital, the family I needed, the family that actually showed up. It was at the end of the 3rd week when things started to feel strange. My mother called, not texted, actually called. And in the middle of asking about Hadley, she mentioned that she had spoken to Sandra recently. I thought that was a little odd, since my mother and my mother-in-law were not particularly close, but I didn't think too much of it. My mother said Sandra had mentioned she was worried about me, that I seemed to be struggling emotionally, that she hoped I was taking care of myself. I told my mother I was fine. I was exhausted and scared and running on gas station coffee and prayer, but I was fine in the way that people in crisis are fine, which is to say, I was still standing. Then, at the start of the 4th week, my husband's aunt, Sandra's sister, a woman named Colleen, who had always been perfectly polite to my face, sent my husband a message asking him how I was really doing. She used that word, really, as in the version he told everyone else might not be the truth. She said she had heard I was having a hard time adjusting, that postpartum was hitting me hard, that she hoped Daniel was keeping an eye on me. Daniel showed me the message. We looked at each other. He said, "Where is she hearing this?" I didn't have an answer, but something in my stomach shifted. The thing about Diane is that she talks. It is her primary hobby, her greatest skill, the thing she is most reliably consistent about. She processes every situation out loud, to everyone, constantly. If there is information to be shared, Diane will share it, usually with embellishment, usually with a framing that centers her own insight or concern. And the thing about Sandra is that she curates. She does not talk the way Diane talks. Sandra is careful and deliberate, and when she speaks, it lands with weight because she doesn't do it often. Sandra could say something once, to the right person, in the right tone, and it would be believed. Together, what they had apparently been saying, what we began to piece together over the course of the 4th and 5th weeks, was that I was not doing well. Not in the normal, anyone would understand way, in the clinical way, in the she needs help and Daniel is too close to cease it way. They had been telling people I was struggling with postpartum depression so severely that I was not thinking clearly, that I had become fixated on the NICU, that I wasn't eating, that I had said things that worried them. They expressed this with great compassion in concerned voices as people who cared deeply about our family's well-being. They talked about how hard this must be for Daniel, how they worried about what I was putting him through. What they had actually done, what we eventually understood, was created a narrative that explained away their absence. If I was unstable, then visits might make things worse. If I was fragile, then it made sense to give us space. If I was the problem, then they were not. It was my sister Becca who figured it out first. She had gone home after her first visit, but she called me every single day, and she had been having her own separate conversations with various family members. And she started noticing a pattern, a specific word being used across different conversations, a particular framing that felt coordinated. She called me on a Tuesday evening and said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Has anyone suggested in any way that you're not okay?" I said yes. Several people, actually. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I know where it's coming from." Becca is not dramatic. She is the calmest person I know. When she said she thought something deliberate was happening, I believed her, and I felt something settle into my chest that was cold and very heavy. Daniel started paying closer attention. He went back through messages. He had a conversation with his cousin, Sandra's nephew, who, when pressed, admitted that Sandra had called him sometime in the second week to say she was concerned about me, that she wasn't sure if a visit would help or upset me further, that she was trying to figure out the right approach. His cousin had taken that at face value. Why wouldn't he? It came from Hadley's grandmother. It came from someone who should have known. When Daniel confronted Sandra directly, she did not deny it. She said she had only been expressing genuine concern. She said I had always been sensitive, that she had noticed things at Christmas, that she was simply making sure people understood what was happening. She said this in a tone that somehow managed to be both defensive and sorrowful at the same time, the tone of someone who has been deeply misunderstood despite their best intentions. She also mentioned in that same conversation that she had been planning to bring a gift, a savings bond for Hadley's college fund. She said she hoped, when things calmed down, that we would be open to receiving it. Daniel ended the call and sat down at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands. It had been 34 days since Hadley was born. Sandra had never come to the hospital. We decided together that we were going to arrange a video call, all of them together, Sandra, Diane, Marcus, Colleen, whoever else had been part of these conversations. Daniel's idea. He wanted to look at them. He wanted them to look at us. The call happened on a Sunday evening. There were 7 faces on the screen. Some of them looked cautious. Diane smiled with that particular smile she has, the one that functions as armor. Daniel did most of the talking at first. He was calm in the way that is scarier than anger. He laid out what we knew, the conversations, the specific words that had been repeated, the effect it had had on our family members' understanding of our situation. He did not accuse. He described. Sandra started to speak. She said she had never meant any harm, that she had only been... That's when I picked up my phone. I had Hadley on a video I had taken that afternoon. I turned my phone toward the camera so everyone on that call could see her. She was in her esaulette, wearing a tiny yellow hat that Renee had knitted for her chest moving steadily on her own now, her oxygen support down to minimal. She was 4 weeks old, and she weighed 4 pounds and 8 ounces, and she was, without question, the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I held my phone there for a long moment. I didn't say anything. I let them look. Then I said, "She has been in that hospital for 34 days, and not one of you has come to see her." The silence was complete. Diane opened her mouth. I said, "I'm not finished." I told them what those 34 days had looked like. Not the summary version I had been sending to the group chat, curated and careful and designed not to make anyone feel bad. The real version. The 3 a.m. version. The version where I ate vending machine crackers for dinner 3 nights in a row because I couldn't make myself leave long enough to get real food. The version where I learned the name of every nurse on every shift because they were the people I spent more time with than anyone else in my life. The version where a woman named Renee, who I had met 12 days earlier, held my hand during a particularly bad afternoon when they had to adjust Hadley's breathing support, and I didn't know if it was a setback or just a routine change, and I was too afraid to ask. I told them what Renee had said to me that first day in the lounge. It gets easier to breathe, not better, just easier to breathe. I told them that the people who had shown up for me during this time were not in this family chat. They were not on this video call. Then I said, "Sandra, you called people and told them I wasn't thinking clearly. You told them I was struggling in a way that implied I shouldn't be trusted. And you did that so that no one would ask why you hadn't come." "Yes," Sandra said. "That is not what I..." Daniel said quietly, "Mom." She stopped. I said, "You were going to bring a savings bond." She nodded carefully. I said, "Don't." Another silence. Longer this time. I want to be honest about what that moment felt like. It did not feel triumphant. It did not feel like winning. It felt like setting something down that I had been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. It felt like clarity, the specific kind that comes when you stop hoping someone will be who you need them to be and finally let yourself see who they actually are. Diane said something about how she had only been worried. Marcus said something about how this had all gotten very out of hand. Colleen said she hoped we could move forward as a family. I said, I think we need some time. We ended the call. In the days that followed, Hadley continued to improve. By day 41, she had been moved out of intensive care. By day 47, we were preparing for discharge. We brought her home on a Thursday morning, and the first thing I did was sit in the rocking chair in her nursery, which I had set up 3 months earlier with no idea how things were going to go. And I held her against my chest, and I said her name over and over until I believed it was real. Becca was there. She had driven up the night before and was asleep on our couch. My parents came that weekend. They were awkward in the way that people who have not shown up correctly are awkward when they finally try. Over-helpful, over-complimentary, talking too much to cover the space where apology would have been more honest. I let them hold Hadley. I watched my father hold her in his big hands as if she were something precious. And he was right. She was. And I wanted to ask him where that understanding had been 6 weeks ago. I didn't. Some conversations happen slowly, or not at all, and you have to decide which ones are worth the energy. Sandra sent a card in the mail. Inside it said she hoped we could put this behind us and that she would always love Hadley. She did not apologize. She did not acknowledge what she had done. She simply expressed hope that things would return to normal, as if normal were a place we could all agree to pretend we still lived in. I put the card in a drawer and did not respond. What I know now, on the other side of it, is this. Crisis reveals. You don't get to choose what it reveals, and sometimes what it shows you is devastating. But there is also something that happens when you have been stripped down to the most essential version of yourself, when you are sitting alone at 3 a.m. in a hospital bathroom with the shower running so no one can hear you. You find out very precisely who you are, and you find out very precisely who belongs in your life. Renee and I still talk every week. Her son came home in January, and she sent me a video of him sitting up on his own, grinning this enormous gummy grin, and I cried the good kind of tears. Patricia sent Hadley a handmade quilt for her first Christmas, soft yellow squares with a pattern that Patricia said her own mother had taught her. Cora, the night nurse, waved us out the door on discharge day and said, "You did good, Mama, both of you," meaning me and Hadley, meaning we had both fought and we had both made it. These women were strangers when I met them. They are not strangers now. As for Hadley, she is home. She is loud and opinionated and absolutely certain that the world exists for her personal enjoyment. She grabs my finger and refuses to let go. She has her father's eyes, and according to Becca, my complete inability to sleep through noise. I don't know what the future looks like with Sandra, with Diane, with any of them. I know that trust is not restored by a card in the mail or a hoped-for return to normal. I know that some relationships are changed permanently by what gets said in the hard moments, and by what doesn't get said, and by who shows up and who stays home. I know that I sent a message to a group chat at midnight, exhausted and terrified, and I asked the people who were supposed to love me to pray for my daughter, and I know what happened after that. But I also know that Renee drove me to a follow-up appointment when Daniel couldn't get away from work. I know that Patricia saved me the corner piece of her sweet potato casserole because she had noticed it was the part I always reached for. I know that Becca got in her car at 1 a.m. and drove through the dark with nothing but gas station coffee and the absolutely uncomplicated certainty that I needed her. Family is not always the word we started with. Sometimes it's the one we earned. Hadley is asleep right now, in her yellow nursery, in the crib her father assembled twice because he did it wrong the first time and refused to leave it that way. She is breathing on her own. She is perfect. And if you are in a hospital right now, or in a waiting room, or in a parking garage sitting in your car because you needed 30 seconds where no one could see your face, I want you to know that the people who deserve to be in your life will find you. They don't always arrive the way you expected. They don't always have the title you thought they would. But they come. They always come. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below. I read every single one. And if you know someone who has ever sat alone in a waiting room waiting for family that never showed, share this with them. They should know they're not alone.